Hey everyone, this is Bathymetrics, and today I'm going to be talking about a pretty exciting change that happened in Bitwig 2.5. And this change allows you to make much greater use of 3 Bitwig container devices. If you look over in the browser on the right-hand side of my screen, the containers I'm talking about are FX Selector, Instrument Selector, and the new Note FX Selector. But mostly this has to do with really drastically improving the usability of the instrument selector and the FX selector. Um, the reason these two selector devices are pretty exciting is that they allow you to load them up with a bunch of different synths in an instrument selector, synths or samplers, or the FX selector can have huge chains of, your crazy complex audio processing racks to really creatively mess with your sound. And a selector device, which looks like these things here that are currently deactivated. Let me activate that for a moment. A selector device has multiple channels, just like an instrument layer device or an FX layer device. See, there's also these devices in Bitwig called layer, right? Same things, but they're called layer at the end instead of selector. Um, the layers and selectors have multiple channels in them, or in Ableton world, a rack would have multiple chains in them. These would be called chains. So whether you call these chains or channels or layers, it doesn't matter. The basic ideas are like miniature tracks all inside of a container device. And then depending on the type of container device it is, you can either have all of these tracks or channels running in parallel, or in the case of these selector devices specifically, you've got this little index at the top that lets you choose which track is active at any one time. And these have unique index numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on. And you can actually automate these. So here's my index. And for example, I could say at bar 2, let's switch to index number 2 for the wide square kick, or index number 3 for the kick channel, or index number 4 for the phone channel in this particular device, right? So this is really exciting because it's one sound at a time, it's one channel at a time, and you can automate which channels are flipped to in the middle of an arrangement. And that's pretty exciting stuff. So another nice feature of selectors, and in this case, these are all instrument selectors that I've renamed. They allow you to set up a remote control for it that lets you choose from a list, right? Or in this case, I use a MIDI fighter twister, and by default, each of these 4 remote control slots are always mapped to 8 specific color-coded knobs on my twister. So regardless of which device I select, I can just take a twister knob and jump through my various indexes that way. So this makes for really quick auditioning. You can see it jumping back and forth here to the different channels, which one's active. This makes for very quick auditioning of an instrument layer that's filled with a lot of different synths in it. So let's show you what this looks like. This particular instrument layer has Serum in this channel. It's got Serum in this channel, Serum in this channel, Serum in this channel, but they could be completely different synths from completely different vendors. And the idea is that I'm using the instrument selector to build these pre-built palettes of similar sounds, like useful types of sounds. As you can see here, I'm just collapsing these so they're all together. I'm building a set of basses, bass tops, leads, pads, and plucks. I'm in the middle of building out some of these palettes for a style of music that I'm starting to do. And I'm looking for specific sounds, and then I'm adding them to each of these instrument selectors as I go, so that later, when I want to start working on a new project, I can say, well, let me start with a pluck sound, for example. And I can go to my pluck uh, instrument selector, and I can drag it out from my user library, of instrument racks. Let's get rid of some things here so you can see everything. Like I've got lots of sampler-based instrument racks in here, but pretty soon I'm going to be having a bunch of synth-based instrument racks sitting in here too. And I'll be able to just scroll down to this section that I'll start with the word which, and I'll be able to drag out any one of these pallets into my project and just instantly scroll through all my different plucks while I experiment to figure out which one I want. And then now I have a pluck sound I can work with. And so the idea is to have pre-built groupings of related sounds. And this is very similar to the notion of an artist standing at an easel and they're holding a wooden palette with all their different color dabs on it, right? And they just choose from those color dabs as they work on their painting. It's a similar concept, and that's why I like to use this word palette. It's actually a concept I learned from Il Gates once upon a time. So that's what I'm doing, and I'm going to show you two things in this video. I'm going to actually show you how to quickly build palettes and how to set them up efficiently, but I'm also going to show you how to manage them so that the total memory impact on your system is as minimal as possible. So first things first, let's go talk about the way that VSTs work and the way memory management works now. In 2.5, they've totally changed the layout of this plugin section in your settings. This is very new, this whole plugin hosting mode. It used to just be 3 choices, and it was really hard to figure out what they were doing. And especially when you had certain plugins in your system that needed to talk to each other, like spectrum analyzers that could overlay multiple tracks on the same spectrum analyzer graph, or Isotope has a lot of things like Ozone and Nectar 3 and so on that can all use little things called a little plugin called Relay to sort of be a tap into different tracks and then roll a bunch of stuff up into the behavior of Nectar or Ozone or whatever. So there's a lot of plugins that need to talk to each other, and it was hard to set that up prior to 2.5. But now, the easiest way, and probably the best overall middle ground way to set up your plugin hosting behavior in Bitwig is to just choose this option right in the middle called By Manufacturer. What this means is any plugin made by a certain manufacturer gets loaded up into its own instance of what Bitwig Studio calls its plugin host process, right? So let's briefly explain what's going on here in my current view of all the processes happening in Bitwig. There's 1, 2, 3, 4 plugin host instances, and each one of those relate to 4 different manufacturers of plugins that I have in this product right now, in this project rather. So Serato sample is in one track, and that's one of these plugin hosts at the bottom. Serato sample is pretty small in size. If I were to guess, I'd say it's probably this one that's taking up about 7 megabytes of memory. Scalar is made by a different manufacturer, so it's in a different plugin host down here. It's probably the smallest one at 5 megabytes. And then Atlas is by yet another manufacturer. That's probably this one that's taking up about 40 megabytes. That's like a drum sampler thing. So this really big one here that's 1200 megabytes is my track with all the Serum instances on it. So Serum, if you weren't aware, takes about 100 megabytes per instance of Serum. That's its memory footprint, at least in Windows. So if we collapse my browser to show you all the instances here, this one track called Palette Building has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 10, 11. Let's count again. I can't count. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 instances of Serum in it. Every one of these channels is Serum. Okay, so that's why this particular 1200 megabyte plugin process is the one that's hosting all 12 of those instances of Serum. So if one serum crashes, all the other 12 are going to crash too, but at least it isn't crashing any other track on my project or any other plugin by any other manufacturer. So each one of these plugin hosts is like an individual sandbox. And as I've showed you in previous videos, Bitwig is really, really resistant to crashes because if a plugin crashes, it doesn't crash the project. Even if a plugin crash causes the entire audio engine to crash, it doesn't crash the project. So it's really hard to lose your work in a project like it is in Ableton. It's very rare that Bitwig just outright crashes and you lose work that you were doing in the project. Usually all that happens is some badly behaved plugin will fail and crash and take down the one host process that it's in, and it won't even affect the other plugins. And you get a little button that says, do you want to restart those plugins? You say, yeah, and usually are up and running in about 3 seconds. So the thing to note here is that I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 serum instances that are active. See how these two container, well, the serum itself is active and this one instrument layer is active. So all 4 instances of serum inside it are also active. But these other 4 are turned, well, these 3 are turned off. Let's turn that one off too. And you'll notice that even though I turn, watch this number up here, this 1200 megabyte number. Even though I turn these layers on and off, a 1200 megabyte number doesn't change. Okay. This is important, and this is what was wrong with versions 2.4 and previous when they first introduced these instrument selectors and FX selectors. The problem is if you really load one of these up with like 10 or 20 synths, every one of those synths is taking up memory, even if they're not active, even if they're not being used. Like none of these are actually in use right now. They can't be played. They're inactive to some degree. Well, they're toggled off to be more precise. And in this selector, I'm only using this one that's selected with the little yellow symbol. These other 3 aren't being used, and yet the whole thing is taking up memory. So prior to 2.5, it was possible to make pallets like this and use them, but you know, if you loaded up a palette with 20 or 30 different synth presets, it would take a big chunk of your memory. A lot of people don't have more than like 16 gigabytes of memory. And, you know, 20 synths, depending on how large the synth is, could take, gosh, 2 to 4 gigabytes of memory just for one of these instrument layers with like 20 different synths loaded in it. And that's too much memory, right? You can't have too many of these in a project before you literally would run out of memory. But here's what's changed in 2.5. Watch what happens when I start, well, let me just deactivate the whole thing. This has 4 instances of serum in it, which is roughly 400 megabytes of memory, right? Now I'm going to press my shortcut key to just deactivate it. There's 2 states for any kind of plugin. There's toggled on and off, but there's also deactivated, which looks like this. And see how it's this little 0 symbol now in the upper left corner? Look at what happened to my number up here. It went from 1200 to 800. That means all 4 of these instances of serum got unloaded from memory as soon as I deactivated them. Let me activate this entire instrument layer again. And you can see briefly here, it was loading those 4 plugins, and now we're back up to 1200 meg of memory. So this leads us to a very interesting trick. Let's say I'm looking for a mid-bass sound to use in a drop, and I go grab one of my pallets that has 10 different mid-basses in it. And for a minute, it takes up a good gigabyte of memory because there's 10 different instances of serum in it, right? And I'm scrolling through and auditioning these, like, let's see, let's make sure this one's turned off. Right? So you can scroll around and look for the sound you want. quickly, instantly, because they're already set up and your serum's already set up with your custom tweaks to it and so on. So you've tuned this palette to just quickly be roughly the same volume, exactly the kind of serum tweaks you want to the starting preset, or maybe you made your own serum presets, and it's just ready to go. It's just ready to scroll through and select one of these sounds to use. Now, once I determine which sound I want, like, let's say I go with the wide kick sound, and I want to use that. Then watch what happens to this 1200 megabyte number up here. I can simply select the other channels, and I held down Control to multi-select around the one that's actually active. So these three are selected, held down Control, clicked each one. Now I deactivate them. All three of those channels are deactivated. I'm down to 900 megabytes. In other words, only one instance of serum is actually loaded into memory now. And I don't have to do anything else. This is now basically like one instance of serum in my project. Think about that. Think about the ramifications of that. And it is literally as easy as, you can hold down Shift and multi-select all the channels and deactivate them, and suddenly they fall out of memory. Or you can, if you bring them in this state where they're all deactivated, you can just multi-select them and activate them all. And then you can start toggling through them. Let's just make sure that's the only one we're hearing. Okay, so quickly find the one you want. Like, let's say I want this little crackly top. Let's see, which one do I like? Like, that could be a good subtle top layer for a bass, right? Turned down very low. So let's say that's the one I want to use. Again, I could come in here and just multi-select around it, deactivate those, and now I'm using, one of my top layer sounds that I want. And this top layer is coming from a synth, right? And this one's still active, but these two are deactivated and they're not taking up any memory up here, right? So this is a very, very efficient thing to do. It's a way, I am slowed down so much when I'm making projects by going, okay, damn it, I want this icy pluck sound here. And so what do? You load up Serum, you try and use the Serum browser to search for the keyword pluck, and then you sit there and up and down arrow through like 100 different plucks you might have in your Serum library, and it's just very slow, and you're like, well, maybe that one, well, maybe that one. But what if you did this ahead of time and you just had these palettes ready to go with the best sounding plucks of a certain style for a certain genre you want to build, or the best sounding mid basses, or just really cool, creepy, weird mid bass tops you could layer on top of your basses. And you're just, as you're auditioning through Serum or Pigments or, whatever synth you like to use, you're just adding them to these palettes when you find a really good one in a set of related sounds. And you slowly build up a palette. And then what you can do is basically just deactivate everything in the palette, make sure it's fully deactivated. And then you can right click this and save the preset to your library and give the palette a name, give it some tags and descriptions, whatever you want. And now you have this handy thing you can drag into your project at any time when you need bass tops. And then they're all deactivated by default. So even if your project is big and crowded, you could, double check your memory and maybe decide you have enough room to go ahead and activate all of them in one go, and then scroll through and audition them, figure out which one you want to use, and then just take the other ones that you're not using and deactivate them again. Simple, easy, great. So good for project efficiency, right? And now you've got these pre-built palettes. And it's important to note that, one of the advantages of a selector device is being able to automate jumping around between two different things, right? So let's say for whatever reason, I decided at one point in the song I wanted to use this as a bass top, but at a different point in the song, I wanted to use this one as a different bass top. And so I have a corresponding automation lane that's letting me do that. Like, I start out the song with, well, let's get the right one up. Let's just touch this. Okay, there we go. So, I start out with simple Reese, and then at a certain point, I decide I want to start using the 1788 crackle instead, right? So I can set up automation, and then all I have to do is make sure that those are the only ones that are still active in the FX layer. And I would make sure any other chains I'm not using are deactivated, okay? So that they're not actually using up any memory. So very efficient. So that's the basic idea behind the memory management and demonstrating that when you deactivate something in Bitwig, it always used to stop using your CPU, like it would reduce the impact on your CPU itself. That always worked. And the other thing that deactivating in Bitwig does is it removes any latency that the plugins in that chain are using. Like any kind of plugin that incurs latency, if you deactivate it, not just toggle it off, but deactivate it, latency disappears. If you deactivate the track that has plugins on it making latency, you deactivate it, all that project latency disappears, right? It always did that, but what Bitwig wasn't doing until just now in version 2.5 is also freeing up memory when something was deactivated. And so that's the big change in 2.5. Anything you deactivate now, entire tracks, specific plugins, or container devices like these, when you deactivate them, they're gone from memory too. So CPU, latency, memory, all the resource impact is gone when it's deactivated. So this means, in Ableton Live, for example, and even in Bitwig up till now, a lot of us, when you're doing heavy sound design, even in the early composing stages, you've got tons of creative plugins plastered all over your project, and they're all eating up memory, and they're all eating up CPU, and they're all eating up latency and so on. So we would constantly like save off new versions of the project as we go and try and flatten tracks to audio and so on and so forth. And that's still important in terms of CPU and latency to, if a track is starting to get really big and bulky because of all the plugins on it, maybe it's time to bounce it to audio. But before, you would need to bounce it to audio and basically get rid of the track somehow, usually by versioning a new project save and then deleting the original track with all the plugins on it from the new saved version. But you don't have to do that anymore because you can literally take an entire track and just deactivate the track. And then all of the memory impact of everything on that track is just gone. And then Bitwig has this really cool button right here. I've talked about in other videos. You can tell Bitwig to automatically hide deactivated tracks from you. So for example, let's bring this one back and let's reactivate it for a second. And if I had a clip on this track, like we'll just make a short MIDI clip and we'll just put in a C2 note for the whole 2 bars or bar. So let's say, out of this whole track, I've got this one simple Reese from this one palette that's making a sound with C2. Okay, just like that. So let's say this was starting to get really full up and I was in here testing different palettes and I finally find the sound I want. And, I could deactivate as much as I want, but at some point, I may just want to get rid of all impact from this track entirely. So I would normally just, let's close this down and let's just bounce. Bounce prefader 32, right? So you'd bounce to a new audio track. And then the thing is, if I deactivate the original and just tell Bitwig not to show me the original, anything that's deactivated, all I have now is the new audio bounce, but my original MIDI track with all the stuff on it is still around. And if I ever need to come back and make changes, like at some point later in the mix down process, something about this track just isn't working right, and I can't fix it with EQs or compressors or whatever. So I decide I need to go fix it at the source by finding the old track, reactivating it, making some sort of change, for example, to this instance of Serum. Maybe I make some tweaks inside of Serum itself, right? Or maybe I add some more processing effects in the chain after Serum, like, you know, whatever. Add a compressor, do something with compression and so on, right? I somehow fix the original MIDI in a way that makes sense and fixes the problem I'm having with my mix. And then I can literally just delete this old clip or delete the whole track that I had originally bounced and just rebounce again with the new changes. And then go deactivate the track again. And all the resource impact of that deactivated track is just gone. So this means you never have to really keep versioning projects forward and losing your original MIDI or your original heavy sound design plugin processing or any of that. You can just keep moving along, deactivating tracks, letting Bitwig hide them away, and just move forward with flattened audio tracks as you need to keep your CPU efficient. But you can always get back to the originals easily by just toggling that one button and coming back and making changes like I just showed you. But, you know, the point is all the impact, including the memory impact, is just gone when you deactivate it. Okay, so that's the big, to me, the big wow feature of version 2.5. This is so awesome. Ableton can't come close to this, right? In Ableton, you got to flatten and version as you go along because projects get bloated really quick with plugins and they just do not sandbox or manage the plugin usage nearly as efficiently as Bitwig does. Okay, so let's get back to the second part that I wanted to show you, which is just how to go about making these pallets. And let me just go activate all these again because memory is not an issue. Get all these back. Hello, let's turn you on. You're on already, you're on already. I'm just kind of getting back to where we were real quick. Okay. Looks like you're both on. You're on. You're on. All right, you've still got some things that are turned off. Activate you. You're active. You're active. You're active. You're active. Okay. So we're back to where we need to be. So here's the basic process for just quickly creating a bunch of palettes from a synth as you're browsing through a synth. I've got 5 different instrument selector devices here, and I'll add a new one just right in the middle right here. So selector, I'm going to show you 2 tricks for using instrument selector or FX selector. So I'm adding a new empty instrument selector. By default, it's got this long name. Usually you want to go over in the inspector and give it a name for the type of palette you're doing, like box shout 1. Okay. Give it a descriptive name. And by the way, here's a trick that took me a while to learn. You can have 2 or 3 spaces between words when you're naming it in the inspector, and see how that makes the separation between the words much more readable down here. So I usually put 2 spaces in between each word up here now, and that makes it a lot easier for my eyeballs to read these sideways and see enough space between the words. So you rename the device. And then another thing that's very useful is to set up a remote control page. By default, the FX layer device does not, I'm sorry, none of the selector devices have a remote control page. Let me show you what happens when I drop in a FX selector, because I haven't set that one up yet. So by default, when you open up the remote control page for a selector device, it says there's no remote control page. So here's a really useful thing to do. Click your wrench, scroll down here to the section called device pages. This top section is making remote control pages that are unique to this one instance of this preset. But if you go down to the bottom section that says device pages, you're making these remote controls that you set up here available by default for every new instance of this this device you bring into the project. So you want to work in the bottom half, and you just click the plus sign to create a page. We're going to double click it and give it a name like controls. Okay. And then you can close this by closing the wrench. Yes. Actually, darn it, I'm probably going to have to stay in this mode while I assign these. Okay. So while you've got these little Wi-Fi symbols, just click this first one and then click the selector area right here. Right? And now we can save and apply, and we can close this down. And now by default, every new version of FX Selector I bring in will have this controls remote control page ready. And this first slot will be assigned to the index selector. So if I start adding things here, like we'll just add various devices and different channels. Let's bring in API EQ here and so on. Okay. And then now I can use this to select which one is active, right? Or again, if you have some sort of MIDI controller that's automatically mapping itself to shortcuts all the time, depends on your controller template. In my case, my controller template for the MIDI Fighter Twister automatically says whichever one of these I select, whichever device I've selected, I've got 8 buttons, 8 knobs rather, that are always just automatically controlling slots 1 through 8. And they're color coded, like on my Twister, it's a red knob to jump between these two. It would be a purple knob to jump to twiddle this value, or a blue knob to twiddle this value, and so on. It's really nice. So by setting up this default remote control page on your FX selector device and on your instrument selector device, you can make it a lot nicer to work with down the road. So again, if I bring in the FX selector, you can see that now that I brought in a new one, by default, it already has this remote control page with this selector ready to go. And that's a good trick to know for setting up pallets. So now that we've got that out of the way, let's just delete those ones, and I'll show you my basic process for creating pallets. I was in the middle of going through a couple new Serum presets and deciding which ones I wanted to keep. Serum, I should say, preset libraries, and deciding which ones I want to keep. So I'm working from this one instance of Serum over here on the very left. And that's the only one you want active, because if you have multiple instances of Serum active, then your project doesn't necessarily know which one to play on that track. All right, so you want to make sure you only have one sound generator on a track. Like I could turn off this one and turn on this one, and now it's going to play this sound generator, this version of Serum. Or I could turn on this one and it would be playing this version of Serum, and so on. But in this case, we just want to work from one on the left, and then have all of these FX containers over here that you're slowly building out. They're sitting on the track. They're all toggled off, so they're not interfering with the sound in any way. And we're just using them to drag new instances of Serum into as we go and give each channel a useful name. So I think I left off somewhere around here. Where was I? Yeah, pad, pluck. Right? So I like this pluck sound, and I think that's the one I dragged into this plucks selector. I called it a mid pluck, so I'm just going to keep going. Well, these are subs. F3 sub. That's really weird. I guess that's meant to layer in with F3 basslines. I'm picky about subs, and I've got subs I really like, so I'm going to skip that one. And now we're into a different set entirely. So let me go find a different set I want to work with. Let's look through this one. I'm basically setting up some mid-tempo palettes for myself, because I want to make mid-tempo music for a while. So what are we starting with here? Mid-tempo. Let's just start with the mid bass. Well, let's see these ARPs. I'll check out these ARPs. No, I don't like, I usually don't like Serum ARPs. Those are terrible. Sorry. Sorry, Evo sound. Let's see. Let's just start with the mid basses. Wow, these are all set to F3. Okay. Well, I'd probably want to change that in my palette, but for now I'll just grab them all as F3s and go mess with these serum presets and change the octaves on them later. Yeah, don't like that one. Okay, that's a good mid-tempo bass. So I'm going to add that one to my basses palette right here. So the way to do it, once you find a sound you like, you can get really anal and double check the volume it's putting out. Like, that's a little low. Let's crank up the master just a little bit. I like them all to hit about -2 dB over here on the track meter. So now that I've got it set up the way I want, here's the trick. Just select your instance of serum and duplicate it. Control D to duplicate. So it's the same exact one right here. Now take the duplicate and just drag it right into your palette and then give it a name. Like these are 2 saws. So I'm just going to call this one all right, so I've named it. It's now in my palette. It's taking up a little memory, but who cares? I'm working in a very sparse project right now because I'm just palette building. So I move on to the next one. I just pick my next preset. Okay. That could be good with enough distortion processing on it, so I'll keep that one. So check the volume real quick. And you can check the volume 2 ways. You can use your track inspector to see the volume that way, or you can just click serum. No, yeah, serum won't do it. But if you click if you click a specific layer or channel inside of a palette, you can also get this channel specific thing that gives you a channel specific volume meter. And that's really good for fine tuning your palettes to make sure they're all the same volume as you scroll through the palette. That can be useful to see what's going on over here. But in this case, since I'm just using a single instance of serum, I'll use the track itself. So that's a little low. Let's take that up. That's close enough. Okay, so I'll select, duplicate, drag it in. And this is a triangle square. No, it's a saw. That's not quite a saw. The hell is that shape? I guess that's a saw square. Yeah, let's call this. I always get confused about these shapes and which one's triangle, which one's saw. Okay, go to the next one. Oh, that's a good one. So hard to describe that shape. It's not quite a basic shape because we've got some folding going on there. So we'll just give this a different name. Wait, what's my level at? That's good. Duplicate, drag it in, rename. Silly name, but I'll take it. So you get the basic process. I'm not going to make you walk through more of this, but this is how I've been building out all these palettes when I decided to stop and make this video. It's a really fast way to go. And again, it doesn't matter what synth you're using over here. You can mix Serum, Avenger, Thorn, FM8, Massive. You can mix anything you want inside of an instrument selector. I'm just working through some Serum libraries and adding them, and later I'll work through some Avenger libraries, and after that I'll work through some Thorn libraries. So then the only other real question is, how big do you want these to get? How many different layers do you want in a specific instrument selector, specific palette? So I would say, in general, maybe 20 at most, because if you enable all of them, depending on your synth, Like if it's serum, 20 serums is going to be about 2 gig of memory. That's a lot. So you might want to make it 10 per FX selector. Other synths like VPS Avenger are really huge. They're like 800 megabytes for the first instance. And then for whatever reason, Avenger is smart enough that if you add additional instances of Avenger in the same plugin host process, each new instance takes about 400 meg apiece. So, I would say no more than eight VPS Avenger instances in a pallet. And that would be about 1.5 gig to 2 gig of memory by the time you're done, if you activate all those tracks. So just think in terms of, try to understand how big your synths are and how much impact each synth has in your Bitwig memory management here. And then let that be your guide as to how many to stuff into one pallet, because you basically don't want any one pallet taking more than 1 gig or 2 of your RAM. So you can bring in a pallet, have enough headroom in your RAM to be able to load all the things in that pallet into memory and scroll through and audition them and figure out which ones you want. And then you can deactivate all the ones you're not using. So that's the way I think about how big to make these. It really depends on the synth itself and how much memory each instance of that synth takes up. So that's all I have for you today. I hope this was some helpful stuff and get you a little excited about version 2.5, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.